Tansei relatives, welcome back to Anti Time Podcast, a space where we speak about healing, justice, and truth through storytelling. And today I invite you to join me in a reflection that I've done. I took a trauma informed lawyering class. That's not the actual name, but it essentially is a class where we apply a trauma informed lens into the profession of lawyering, of being in the legal space. So today's episode revolves around trauma, but not just like a word we throw around, such as trauma dumping, but as a real biological, emotional, and spiritual experience. I want to talk about what trauma actually is, what it means to be traumatized, and what happens inside our brain and our body, and why understanding trauma is essential if you want a justice system that isn't just punitive, and more of a justice system that heals. And this applies to an indigenous lens as well, because through our indigenous laws, our laws aren't created to harm. They come from the creator, and they're meant for healing and restoration, and finding balance within our relationships. So it all applies, especially for the space of what anti-time is and what we talk about. We love to learn, we love to heal, and we love to do this through the art of storytelling. So get ready, settle in. So let's begin. We're going to start off by talking about what trauma actually is. So oftentimes people think that trauma is like this big catastrophic event, this one-time life-altering event, but that's actually not true. Trauma is not an abuse. It's not an accident. It's not a situation where someone's being incarcerated. But trauma is the imprint that the event leaves inside of us. Trauma is the disconnection that forms when something overwhelms our ability to cope. As Dr. Gabor Mate explains, trauma is not about what happened to you, but about what happened inside of you as a result. Trauma occurs when your emotions are too big to hold, your body goes into survival mode, and we'll talk more about that later. Your needs are unmet or punished. So Dr. Gabor kind of explained, as a young child, you're crying and you're angry and you get punished and you get told that children that are angry don't get loved. Eventually that follows into your adult life, and you create this belief that if you repress your anger, that you will be loved. And that essentially is an example of us suppressing our emotions that can eventually impact the way you cope. You learn to suppress parts of yourself in order to stay safe. But that type of trauma disconnects us from our emotions, our physical sensations, our ability to trust, and our capacity to feel safe. And sometimes it disconnects us from our very sense of self. So essentially, this is why two people can experience the same event, but only one becomes traumatized. Trauma is about the internal response, not the external situation. So essentially, it's the way you cope with things and your ability to cope. And through this course, we've learned about aware, care, and cope. And essentially, aware is being, aware of your trigger, your stressors, and building a toolkit, a self-care toolkit to help yourself cope. For example, for myself, my self-care essentially needs to be talking with my mom or my friends and laughing, but also, doing my skincare and brushing my teeth, working out and moving my body. Like, those are things that I use for medicine. And when you're aware of your stressors and you're aware of why your body's operating the way it does, you can essentially pull out your toolkit, and it makes it a little bit easier. Of course, it's really hard when you're in a state of your body is in an energy where it feels essentially defeated. But this is when we kind of go into talking about the connection between trauma and the nervous system and our bodies. A little bit about my mental health journey is I am currently diagnosed with anxiety. I actually went to the doctors because when I started law school, I was so consumed with anxiety. And the way I can explain it is like if you ever heard like bad news and your stomach turns, okay, think about that. But it was like every day, as soon as I woke up in the morning. And I just realized that that wasn't healthy. Usually with my anxiety, I'm like, okay, it will pass, it will pass. But the chronicness, it wasn't going to pass. So, it kind of made me think of like, what can I do besides, getting prescribed SSRIs? What can I do to kind of help mitigate and not contribute to my own harm? So I have a little bit of a personal experience of dealing with trauma. I'm also Indigenous, and I think as collectively we share a collective trauma based on our historical colonial legacy upon our people. But going back to like the body and the nervous system, I always disregarded what a nervous system was. I didn't think it was important, but now with my healing journey and learning about the ways that I cope, I understand now that there is a severe connection between your brain, your nervous system, and how you react and how you cope. So during my mental health, I would essentially work myself and stay in this fight or fight energy until I absolutely can't. And then suddenly my body would shut down. And then you wake up and you're so exhausted and you can't move and you don't want to move. And you don't brush your teeth, you don't shower. And learning through this course that it's because when your body operates in fight or flight, which I feel like a lot as Indigenous people, we collectively do. And I'm not, and we are able to like accomplish things in this energy, but it's a very like chaotic energy. And your anxiety operating it's in the polyvagal theory, it's called your sympathetic energy. This is a high alert survival state. The heart races, the breath quickens, the brain scans for danger. And this is very interesting to me because it's essentially your brain trying to keep you safe. It's a biological response, but often we're not hunting, but we're in a room, we're in a classroom, and then your brain's like scanning for all the issues. It's trying to keep you safe, but the danger is here, and the harm that causes is if your brain body is constantly in fight or flight, it's scanning for issues constantly, and then your brain is creating a negative self-belief because it's always looking for the issue. So that's why it's important, because our minds are so powerful, and if you want to build a positive belief system and a positive outlook, you have to get your nervous system right. You have to get yourself out of that fight or flight mode because the body is flooded with adrenaline. Many Indigenous people live here because our nervous systems were shaped by generations of instability, violence, policing, and colonialism. So when the danger can't be escaped, the body believes it is powerless and it shuts down. This is called a dorsal vagal. This is the polyvagal theory that we're going through. So you disassociate, you feel disconnected, you have a difficulty speaking, you have flattened emotion and shutting down memories. And if we apply this to the legal lens, courts often misinterpret that as lying, avoidance, or lack of remorse. But it's actually a neurobiological survival response. So something that is very, very common in the modern world, the legal system has often refused to kind of catch up to applying that trauma-informed lens, because if you see someone, especially a young Indigenous perpetrator, in the courtroom and they're looking down and they don't want to answer and they're getting asked tough questions, you're going to view this person as someone who is heartless, remorseful, and perhaps a danger to society, but in fact are having a biological response to the trauma that they have endured. So what is next? The ventral vagal. That's your safety and connection energy. This is where the healing happens. This is where the nervous system relaxes and where we can think clearly and express ourselves and remember details, communicate and connect and regulate emotions. But the issue in the legal space is that's where most environments, courtrooms, interrogations, cross-examinations trigger fight, flight, or freeze and not connection. So, And to be clear, like it's impossible to constantly stay in your ventral vagal system, and that's not what I'm telling like the listeners to do, but being able to regulate your energy where you have a good balance of being in that system and then being able to manage and cope when you're in your sympathetic, that's your fight or flight. And then essentially, you don't have to drop down into dorsal, or if you do, you have the skills to cope. For me, I stay in that energy a lot. I feel like a lot of law students do. We operate in our sympathetic because it's a high competitive state, very scarcity mindset. And I was able to point that out when I first got into law school because kind of the same thing in the res scarcity mindset. There isn't enough for anyone. Another person's loss is another person's gain. And that is very harmful to the mental health and your safety connection that you have in an environment because you're constantly looking over your shoulder. So before law school, I was kind of used to that competitiveness, that mindset be from the res school, from the res life. But and I've obviously learned how to manage, and I reframe my mind as an abundance mindset. And those affirmations that I tell myself is there's enough to go around for everyone. And in law school too, I have to remind myself, not everyone values what I value. Not everyone wants what I want. And there's a job, there's a position out there for me where I could do the work that I want to do. So a way that I cope with that is just positive affirmations and always reminding myself. But, it's really hard for those affirmations to have impact when you're operating in flight or fight, or in the polyvagal terms, in your sympathetic energy, or in dorsal vagal. So that's what I kind of understood through this course. That was the big click in my brain. I was like, oh my God, that's why my meditation isn't working, is because I am trying to tell myself I'm okay when my body does not feel okay. So breath work really helps for the nervous system, just 5 minutes a day, just working, breathing in and out, and really understanding what grounding means. We always say ground ourselves, but actively doing steps to get ourselves aligned, it really helps. And then for me, because my anxiety is so high, I had to go on medication. But that doesn't mean that the work stops there. Like I still work on stuff. I still ground myself. I meditate. I work out as much as I can. But I'm not, for sure, after this year, like I'm not perfect. But I think the awareness part is so important because when I catch myself kind of slipping down into that dorsal, I have my toolkit. I know that I have to move my body. I know I have to talk to someone like my mom or my husband or my friends, or I have to force myself to take a shower and take care of myself. And it's really important to just be aware of what helps you and what helps you heal. I wanted to talk about this in this podcast because as Indigenous people, we have a collective trauma, an intergenerational disconnection. For Indigenous people, trauma is not individual. It is systematic and collective, especially when we look through the legal system. I think an important thing to note is the statistics show that oftentimes kids in the highest number for kids in the child welfare system are Indigenous. And then a lot of those kids that go into permanent orders and are disconnected from their families and communities, they end up in the criminal justice system. So policies and systems were intentionally designed to sever our nervous systems from safety. We see this through residential school, the 60s scoop, the millennium scoop, policing, child welfare, poverty, and systematic underfunding. Those are all real issues. And they all have impact on our bodies and on our biological responses and on our brains. We have essentially a collective that is hypervigilant, emotionally suppressed, we distrust. We are just trying to survive. But I will say, like, our people are really like resilient, operating in that survival mode. We've done it and we are able to do really good things. But I often notice like it's really hard to deal with conflict in a healthy way when you have a group of people that are in just survival mode or have a dysregulated system. I was making this joke earlier about because I'm in law school, I'm not a practicing lawyer, I can't offer legal advice, and I think my best advice I can give that is ethical is regulate your nervous system. Because when conflict arises, you are able to think more clearly, you'll have a better connection with your brain, and be able to move forward in a healthy, healing way. And it all starts with us, it all starts with that inner work. And because trauma is passed down through behavior, parenting, community systems, the survival mode becomes a collective inheritance. So, understanding this is essential because the indigenous people show up in the justice system, and the system often misreads trauma responses as defiance, non compliance, aggression. You're not going to comply with someone you don't feel safe with. You're not going to comply with, or you're not going to be able to cooperate when you are essentially feel unsafe. Like, that's just the facts. And in the legal system, this person may look like someone who is dangerous and someone who is, out of hand and a threat to society. But yet, this is just an individual who is dysregulated from the circumstance given to them. For Indigenous people, it is systematic. And, we don't talk about this enough. We don't talk about the actual impact, the scientific and biological impact of trauma. We always talk about traumatic events and trauma dumping. And the thing about trauma dumping is we got to be mindful of that. And we got to make sure that we aren't indirectly exposing people to trauma. Because there is this thing called vicarious trauma that a lot of like lawyers or social workers or just people in those frontline positions that they get traumatized because they're around traumatized people. And it's indirect, but it's still has impact and it still has harm. So just being mindful of, the stories you share and ensuring that it's a safe space for not just you, but for all parties. I think that's an important tool or practice that we could start doing as a collective. Because, I've been guilty of that, going into a room and just trauma dumping on someone and then leaving, and then then they're left with that, and what are they supposed to do with it? Like, so just being mindful of that practice. And we talk about trauma and we talk about it in the justice system and how our people. And the reason why this is important is because to rethink what a legal system, what a justice system does if we consider trauma. I brought up this point, if you were to be a victim and you were in the courtroom and you're cross-examined and you are having a biological response to the traumatic event that has happened to you and the unsafety you feel being in such a foreign, weird space, and you have lawyers telling you and accusing you of you're lying or being really hard on you and not coming from a place of understanding, that could, and essentially what that harm does in the long lasting impact, and your perpetrator ends up getting life behind bars, but you still feel unsafe in your body because you weren't treated fairly, and you have this like impact on yourself and on your body from this experience of being in the legal system. Is that justice? But if you really think about it, if you don't feel safe in your own body, and the harm that the legal system has brought that onto you, like, is that really justice? If you don't feel safe, even though the victim, who is probably having more harm done to them because they are also behind bars in an unsafe space with low minimum food and constantly having to look over your shoulder, like, is anyone healing in that situation? Is anyone moving on for the better? No. And this is like the reality of our justice system, is because we don't consider trauma, we have lawyers that take advantage of, even if they know this knowledge or if they don't, but taking advantage of those social cues and using it to win a case. But also, the victims that are left to deal, and we don't have a holistic system. We don't have a system that checks on them afterwards. I know that there has been more reform, but overall it needs to be a systematic shift and change. So why the legal system fails? Its trauma is misunderstood. So traditional legal systems are built around logic over emotion, competition over connection, interrogation over understanding, and punishment over healing. Everyone deserves to heal, and I think that's what's important. Especially, it's really hard to say that, or no, it's really easy to say that that person deserves to be behind bars and that person deserves what's coming to them. Like, that's really easy to say and have that roll off your tongue. What it's really hard to do is look at someone's situation and their background and understand where that's coming from, understand why they decided to harm, and looking at their story. That's the hard part. And the reason why I think I'm able to kind of really have that outlook of understanding is because, like, growing up Indigenous, our people are not perfect. Far from it. Because of our circumstance, I had a dad who was an amazing dad, and he went to jail. He went to jail for 6 months, but understanding that he was never a criminal in my mind. He was an educator. He actually was a teacher. He was a coach. He was a father figure. He was a friend. And as Indigenous people, we share that because we don't keep them under this label. And just because someone has done something wrong, that doesn't mean that they don't deserve a space to heal. Especially like someone like, for my dad, for example, like, I'm glad he didn't get the full sentence of when he went. He only got like 6 months, but still, as a child, that was 6 months that me and my brother didn't have hockey. That was the months we didn't have our dad on Father's Day or even for his birthday. And so, like, those are things to think about too, that so a lot of times these perpetrators, they have families. There's somebody's son, there's somebody's dad, there's somebody's brother, and same for our women too, because our women place a high number in our justice system. And it's so easy for us to just disregard those people in those jails. And I remember my dad, when that Christmas he got out of jail, he had a video camera because he was always recording, and we were opening up our Christmas presents, and he was saying he's telling us, say Merry Christmas to all those ones in the hospitals and the jails. And me being a kid, I'm like, but Dad, we don't know them. And he's like, well, I know them, but reminding us to acknowledge that those people are suffering and to like pray for them, and have hope that one day that they heal, and one day maybe they can open presents with their kids or their families. It's a very unique perspective, and I, like a lot of people, didn't grow up with a parent that was incarcerated, so I could share that with the ones that do. And I actually wrote about that in my law school letter when we write an essay of why, and I just remember being like, I want to be someone who can consider those circumstances, their background, but also, like, if they have kids, let's come up with a solution that does less harm and more good. And that can be possible in our justice system. The Indigenous ways, we have Cree natural law that will win those kinship ties and those how we govern our relationships, and restoration and trying to help people instead of throwing them into jails. So this is why trauma-informed lawyering matters. You got to understand the nervous system and how someone operates when they're traumatized, and bring that into consideration. Recognize survival responses, reduce harm through communication, and build trust and safety. We talked about in our class, if you have a client, maybe go over that conversation with them and ask them, what do you need when you feel like this? And what do you need when you are triggered? And let's create a toolkit so I know. And I know when you are triggered, and I can offer solutions to help. Because as much as we want people to feel safe, they got to do the work, but we can help bridge that gap as lawyers. And because as lawyers, we work with people, we will work with people, and we will work with people that are triggered. The dean, when we first went into law school, he said, you got to think about it this way. You got to be a kind person because you are dealing with people that are going through life, their craziest life events, and you're going to be there. You know, divorces, businesses, their freedom is in your hands, and big business transactions, like very like no one gets a lawyer for fun. It's often like these really like high stakes situations to get your children back. So we gotta know how to be kind, but also how to help these people in these situations. And to be able to slow things down, validate emotional experience, and even understand cultural trauma. Carolyn Gross narratives lawyering shows that traumatized clients struggle to produce coherent, linear stories. And if you think about that in like the criminal justice system, in order to be tried, you have to go beyond reasonable doubt. But if your brain, if you are in that dorsal or sympathetic activation, your brain won't be able to work properly. You won't be able to remember. And the courts, if they don't consider that trauma response, they could see this as unreliable because trauma fragments energy. Randall Haskoff emphasizes that traumatized people require safety before they can meaningfully engage in legal processes. So, what are we doing today to ensure that victims or even just anyone in the legal space can have meaningful dialogue? And in our class, we talk about that hierarchical setting of a courtroom. You know, you have the judge up here and you have the people down there. Well, that space is telling people that, you know, they're above you. And if you're an Indigenous person who already feels unsafe, and that power dynamic can leave you helpless, it can be actually really harmful. So being mindful of the space we set for people in the legal system, in the justice system. Self-care literature reminds us that helpers, lawyers, judges, and advocates must regulate and ground themselves to support others. This is interesting because we have a high, you know, addictions, substance use rate within the profession. So if you have dysregulated people trying to help dysregulated people, yes, you can. And we talk about that. We learned about that through compassion. Like, you still are able to have compassion for people if you don't have compassion for yourself. The issue is you'll burn out a lot quicker. You'll burn out a lot sooner, and you won't be able to help people to the best capacity of they deserve, but also you want to produce. And it may do more harm to your mental health because you may feel some sort of shame because you know inherently that you can do more, but you're just so burnt out. So it's really important to have those tools for yourself as a professional, to be compassionate and give yourself grace. And my therapist also tells me, like, don't be afraid to high five yourself. You get out of bed and you shower and you brush your teeth, high five yourself, you know, look for the wins. And I think that's so important. And it really does help when you are trying to like be in a space of healing. So trauma-informed lawyering is just not a trend. It's about competence. It is an ethical responsibility, and this is what's going to help us get true justice. You know, the justice we talked about earlier, where both parties are able to heal and move on in a good way. So restorative justice, where healing and accountability meet. Restorative justice, also known as RJ, is inherently trauma-informed. Howard Zern explains that RJ focuses on who is harmed, what do they need, and how can the harm be repaired. You know, this is to create safety and not be so harmful on the nervous system, allow victims to have a voice, allows offenders to take meaningful accountability. I think this is important, and I'm not going to use a legal example to talk about like healing. And sometimes punitive may not always be the answer to punish, but we had a situation, and I'm going to be very general. I'm going to just kind of speak about the situation, but someone we knew made a very like racist remark, and it was kind of, once the person was held accountable, it was kind of brought to my husband what to do, and could have kicked him out of that space that he was in and totally isolate him out from the team. situation. And instead, my husband, he sat with me and we talked about it. And I was like, okay, well, if we, if you guys kick him out and don't offer him any tools of support to get better, he's just gonna hate, you know, he's just gonna hate more. He's just gonna become more hateful. I think that's not the right option. I think maybe you offer a space for him to get restitution and healing and education and provide him that grace because, I think in the long run that will be more, that would have more of a positive impact instead of isolating this person out. And, because for some reason it was up to my husband to kind of guide this conversation. So I directed him with that. And he listens to me. He's a good husband. But, I really think about justice as restoring relationships instead of just isolating someone away and gatekeeping them out. I think it's important to have those dialogues, but in a safe space. And so they were able to do it in that way. But, I think it's to take real accountability. It's easy to just be isolated out and just like not care and not own up because you're already out on the outskirts. But when you're with those people every day and you have to show up every day as someone who's been changing and there's a group to hold you accountable, there's a lot more honor into doing that. So I think it's really important to think about. So in Saskatchewan, we do have restorative justice programs. And the data actually shows that they have a lower reoffending rates and a higher participant satisfaction. Yeah, I totally could see that because, again, when you're with that group that's holding you accountable, you're not going to reoffend inherently if you feel safe enough and if you feel like you're given a chance to heal and grow, then you actually have the opportunity to have some growth there rather than it being punitive and just being thrown to the outskirts. Healing is paramount. I think that's something that is important, and it's something my mom brought up to me when we were talking about restorative justice. Healing is paramount, and that should be the affirmation for our justice system. Instead of punitive, instead of punishing. I know more than anyone that these people in these systems, they have, they just were given a shitty set of cards, and if we were able to get them in that space where they're able to heal, we would have less in these jails, in these reoffending states. A justice system that ignores trauma will always misunderstand people. A justice system that understands trauma can transform them. This is important for Indigenous people because trauma is collective, it's historical and ongoing, and healing is not optional. It's essential to our survival, but also our sovereignty. I think that's enough. We're at the half-hour mark today, but I just wanted to say thank you for listening, and I hope you took away some learning tools to talk about trauma and helping like kind of the public relook of how we view justice. Because at the end of the day, it's not just lawyers that serve justice, but it's the people all around us, and we all have a role to play. And we're all human. Our nervous systems remember what our minds forget. Our bodies tell stories the legal system has never learned to listen to. But we can change that, and we can build a justice system where healing is not the exception, but is the foundation. So I wanted to thank you for joining me on Auntie Time, and I'll see you next time, my relatives.